welcome.
Good afternoon.
Welcome. Is this your first one?
No.
Your second.
Number 2.
Right. I'm going to ask a question which is not entirely relevant to the agenda, but I wanted to get it out of the way and on the table first. And I think it's probably one for Mr. Prettejohn. Have I pronounced that properly?
It's Prettejohn.
Prettejohn. Okay. It's just, as you know, the House has been looking at HSBC and its activities with the Swiss bank. And it's been drawn to my attention that Rona Fairhead has been a non-exec director since 2004, that she was on the Audit and Risk Committee from 2004, so that's throughout that whole period when the HSBC files were an issue, and she was chair of the Risk and Audit Committee in 2007. And the Audit Committee is responsible for governance and compliance, obviously, across the global bank. Now, this is a really prestigious job, being chair of the BBC, so I'm not sure whether it's for you, Lord Hall, or whether it's for you, Mr. Prettejohn, but it's a really prestigious job. The Trust is the guardian of the licence fee revenue and of the public interest in the BBC. And I think, given the very, important questions that are now being asked about HSBC's role in not just aggressive tax avoidance but potential tax evasion, I wondered what due diligence you were now doing between you.
So I want me to go first. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment on the HSBC situation specifically. As far as the Trust is concerned, Rona Fairhead has taken over as chairman in the autumn of last year and appears to be, at the moment, doing a very effective job as chairman. Clearly, there will be a number of investigations into what's happening at HSBC, and it wouldn't be right for me or the Trust at this stage to comment on it.
That sounds to me, what I asked you is, given what has emerged, what due diligence are you now undertaking?
We're not doing anything specifically ourselves.
And what about you?
I don't think it's for me to do due
No, I know, that's why I thought the
with,
question.
with respect, Chair. I think we are answerable to the Trust for all the things that the BBC does. What I would add to what Mr. Prettejohn was saying is that the relationship with Rona Fairhead as chair is a very businesslike and strong and good one, and I think she's doing a very effective job as chair.
That may be, but there are clearly question marks arising out of her role. I mean, I was just taken aback that she was actually chair of the Audit and Risk Committee. I don't know whose job it is to look at it, but I think that does raise issues which somebody should be looking at. And I look to the Trust. You are there on behalf of the, you're the guardians, you're our guardians on this.
Well, I would make 2 points about that. First is that it was not the Trust's own appointment for the chairmanship of the BBC, and therefore it may be right, wouldn't be right, I think, for us to revisit that decision. And secondly, I think that there will be undoubtedly be a number of inquiries by different regulatory authorities and so on into the affairs at HSBC, and obviously the Trust will take note of the content of those inquiries.
She's still on HSBC, isn't she?
I believe so.
Well, I just don't think that's good enough, but we will consider what we do with that. Right, let's go to the report, which is on the whole, things that I think on the whole there's some good things in this report. You've modernised, you've reduced, there are some good things. So within the context of recognising the progress that's been made, can I sort of start asking you some, obviously, questions pouring into should things be better? I think that the sort of thing that comes out to me is that you're shifting your... let me ask you this question first. You're shifting from freehold to leasehold. That's clearly a policy decision. Can you just take us through that first and explain to us why and what you see the benefits are?
Yeah. I mean, the big policy over the last decade has been to reduce the estate and to keep the costs of the buildings and the estate of the BBC level in real terms, to where it was in 2001. And I think swapping from freehold to leasehold has been a part of getting that right. And I think in terms of the overall plan, as I think you acknowledged, and thank you, because I'm sure we'll spend time looking at some of the more difficult issues, but I think we've made a lot of progress. I mean, not to do with me, but people before me, we've made a lot of progress. And I think it's been a period of massive change over 14 years, absolutely massive change in what we expect of our buildings, but also in reduction of the number of buildings that we've got. So I think, in terms of moving from freehold to leasehold, the aim has been to keep flat, in real terms, the cost of our estate.
Okay, but why leasehold? Why get out of freehold and into leasehold? And then I want to ask you a little bit about some of the leaseholds you've got into. Why specifically that?
Leasehold, because the assumption has been that wherever we can do things which are cheaper in the long term and get the redevelopment of our sites and our buildings in all terms done, but keeping within that cap that we've set of no increase, cost flat in real terms, we should do that. And leasehold has worked out more cheaper in those terms than going to a freehold.
Let me just question that a little bit, because there are three examples of where you've entered into these rather long leases, 25, 30-year leases, which actually limit your flexibility as technology changes, as you're producing content in different ways. So the ones that come up in the report are Mailbox in Birmingham,
yep,
where you'd signed a 25-year lease, 2001. I mean, I was just trying to say, when was the decision taken to build the new broadcasting house? When was it actually decided to build that? When was that decision taken?
That goes early 2000s, because the
2004?
replan was discussed in 2004, so really quite a long time
So about
ago.
the same time as you were deciding to build this great big, the big new broadcasting house, you signed a lease here.
Yeah.
If we look at figure 16 on page 31,
Yeah.
in Birmingham, which was a 25-year lease,
Yep.
where you're not using it, it's under-occupied, it's 40% empty, and you can't sublet. And then there's another one, if I can find it.
Media Village.
Media Village.
The Media Village, and then, well, there's a third one. I was going to say Pacific Quay in Glasgow,
Yeah,
is another one. So a change in strategy to go to leasehold, you're tying yourself then into these long leases, which don't give you the flexibility to respond to the changing profile of staffing.
Could I answer? I know maybe Anne wants to add some things. Can I just take them bit by bit, Chair, if that's helpful? So Mailbox, you're right. It was either half empty or half full, depending on how you look at it, because staff were taken away to Bristol, among other places. So when I arrived at the BBC 22 months ago, I went to Birmingham to look at what was going on there. I thought this was unacceptable. Not just because of the sort of the relative emptiness of the building, but also because Birmingham is an important city, and the BBC's role in Birmingham should be an important one. So what we've decided to do, and I spoke to a number of local MPs about this too, is to move both HR, also the BBC Academy training, and also this will be the place where our outreach and our apprenticeships and our work placements, all of that is coordinated in Birmingham, because it struck me, talking with both people in Birmingham, civic leaders and others, and the LEP there, that this was something that kind of fitted with what Birmingham was about. So I hope within the next year that what looks like on page figure 15, where you have vacancies, spare capacity rather, in the mailbox of 351, that will have gone a long way towards curing that issue, and have something that I hope Birmingham can be really proud of.
Good. And then the others?
And so the other one...
The other ones,
Media
it
Village.
comes up, it's this, and the issue of principle is this locking yourself into long leases.
Yeah.
So Pacific Quay, which is on figure 2.
Yes.
which again was about the same time. Am I being... You started that about the same. Operational target date 2006, open 2007. The site is underused. This is page 13. And the layout makes it more difficult to sublet parts of it that are surplus to the BBC requirements. Local market conditions may also limit subletting opportunities.
Madam Chairman, if I go back to the sort of overall principle and then perhaps talk about the specifics. So the BBC property strategy that we are at the end of, the 15-year programme, was absolutely designed to modernise the estate. So we had a vast number of buildings around the country, very many of which were well loved but were not fit for purpose, and they needed significant investment both in the bricks and mortar and in the technology, and different approaches were adopted. But at the heart of the strategy was a proposal that the cost of the estate should be no more at the end than it was at the beginning in real terms, and that also the transition arrangements, the funding, the capital funding that was needed for those buildings would be funded by going to the market and taking the freehold estate and refinancing it through these long leaseholds and bonds in order to achieve that. So that was the principle behind it, and therefore in order to fund the work that was required to upgrade the estate in London, in Scotland, in Birmingham, the lease approach was adopted so that we worked within the borrowing constraints that we were in, and we didn't take any money out of content and services unnecessarily. The potential downside of that, as you rightly put out, is you finish up with less flexibility, one might argue, than perhaps you have with owning freehold buildings. I think there's a couple of points on that. Of course, if you're investing very significant technology into your freehold buildings, which historically you were, you've got a lot of sunk investment there. So you're still tied in for a number of decades to recoup your investment. The other thing is the lease structures are different in the different sites, but across the piece we look for opportunities for breaks, and we also retain the opportunity to sublet wherever we can, and we have good experience of having done that. So we have sublet Henrywood House, which was excess capacity next door to New Broadcasting House. We are at the moment marketing and doing well in subletting part of the W12 estate, the White City estate that you referred to. So the sort of trade-off between using private finance through the bond structures to invest in the infrastructure, in the fit-out and in the technology infrastructure, which is so important, it was the underlying principle behind this shift between the two. Tony's spoken about the mailbox. W12, we have excess capacity there as a result of a deliberate policy of rationalising our London estate and relocating people out of London. We're in the process of moving around 450 jobs abroad to Salford and to Birmingham, which both can help with those sites in terms of some of the excess capacity that you see here, and then releasing that site for sublease or sale.
Is that Media Village?
Yes. Immediately.
But you only leased that in, 2001?
Yes, but as I just tried to explain, when we took that lease, we retained the ability to sublease on, and therefore we have that opportunity to release excess space there, and that's our objective. So the objective would be that by the time we have completed that, the surplus capacity, which is the occupied but underutilised, would move from 12% down to around 6%.
But isn't the essence of the problem, I mean, it may or may not be admirable shifting from freehold to leasehold, but the essence of the problem is that you're paying so much over the odds for the freehold in Broadcasting House, which is a much higher cost than anything else comparable around it, that you're forced into leasehold in order to cut costs in other areas like Manchester.
Yeah, the New Broadcasting House, the cost there, which pushes the cost of New Broadcasting House over the benchmark, is in the bond cost. You're completely correct. That's the proportion of the annual rental which drives that through as a result of refinancing it. That cost, and we can take that now, or you may want to speak about New Broadcasting House
Let's deal with
later.
that a bit separately.
Yes.
Let's deal with the... I've got Amos and I've got David, and I want to come back on.
A couple of points, if I may. First of all, on mailbox, and I recollect having a previous opportunity to discuss this at hearing, and I think we established that you had actually emptied the mailbox building, tried to market it for quite a long period of time, and not been able to get anyone who was prepared to come in as a subtenant. So even though I think it's excellent that you're now using it, it does represent an inflexibility in your portfolio. I think that's probably fair to say. It's good that you're able to use it, that's good, but one of the options not available to you is going to market and getting rid of it if you were to want to. And I think we established that before, so I'm just reminding the committee of that. And then the other point, if I may very quickly, you were making a point about technology, but I think normally you wouldn't expect technology life, and we're talking about 25-year leases, whereas
Sure.
technology life is about 7 years max, and probably rather less for quite a lot of technology. That's right, isn't it?
That's true, but not necessarily for core broadcast infrastructure, which has a longer life.
Thank you.
There's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit of waste, as it were. Just look at the recurring costs. You have a target, I understand, to deliver 6 to 7 million
Yes.
annual savings in recurring property
Yes.
costs. And so you're confident this year that you're going to meet that target?
Yes, we are confident that we're going to hit that target. We have, just give me a moment, I'll just go back to it. We've already achieved, we're on target to achieve 67 million under the DQF programme, which is 20% or so ahead of the original target that we set on DQF. 39 million of that on a recurring basis is already delivered, and a further tranche of that comes through, as reflected in the numbers here. Further tranche comes through as a result of us having just completed a retender of our facilities management contracts, which brings quite substantial savings.
So
And then the rationalisation of the W12
And
site
so
will
just
bring it
recurring,
through.
so that's by the end of this financial year. And your plans for the next financial year, you're confident you're going to be able to meet the same
Yes,
target?
we are. Yes. We don't have any, what we call, we RAG rate our DQF programme. We don't have any red risk on our savings programme, which is not to say it's straightforward. It requires a great deal of work and effort to achieve this. But the plans are in place and we're working through them.
You still haven't convinced me on the general point about, it seemed to me in the early 2000s, you just got hold of too many buildings, or you committed yourselves, you were building the great big new broadcasting house, you got the mailbox, you got this, the one in Glasgow, Pacific Quay in Glasgow, even looking at Salford, it looks very under-occupied, and you just, the strategy looked to me is you're spending more than you need on property, locked into these long leases, at the expense of programmes.
I mean, I think, certainly when I'm looking at this, I'm absolutely as keen as I suspect you all are to ensure that every pound we can goes onto programmes and services. I mean, that's the reason why we're there. But looking at this, I am impressed by the amount of change there's been in the nature of the buildings that the BBC is kind of occupying. 2/3 roughly of these buildings now are new. I don't mean new in the sense of, well, it's all gleamy and wonderful for people to be in, though you hope it's that, but actually new, enabling people to work in kind of different ways. And, we've also reduced the number of buildings we've got down by 30% as well. And I think that's a kind of a very necessary reform that the BBC had to go through.
I don't think, I accept all that. I don't think it answers the question that whoever took these decisions in the early 2000s just locked themselves into too much.
Yeah, I think that some of what we're dealing with here is at a point of transition. So at the moment, the surplus capacity that we've talked about is 12%. By the time we've completed the W12 programme, that surplus capacity will be at 6%. When we complete the programme that we have in mind in Cardiff, that will take it down further under 5%. We would always have an element of swing space anyway. So, for example, in Pacific Quay, that building has been extremely busy over the most recent period as a result of the Scottish referendum and the Commonwealth Games. So we would expect to be running with surplus capacity somewhere between 3 and 5% most of the time in any event.
Well, the report says...
When will you get to below 5%? You said
depending on the timetable of our ability to sublet W12, but I would hope we would be down to 6% by the close of the calendar year. And then
of 2015?
Of 2015, and then the Cardiff programme will take longer to come through.
Yeah, but that was my question. When do you expect calendar-wise to be below 5%? I mean, 2 years, 5 years?
Yes, probably 2 to 3 years.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask of the trust, because we have this 6% target floating around, and it says somewhere in the report that the executive came to you and wanted to raise it, and you clearly thought at the time that it wasn't a politically sensible thing to do. So you were measuring them on a target that they didn't, you were monitoring them on a target that they didn't really own. So my first question is really, did that make sense? And the second is, as a trust today, how do you know 6% is about right? How do you know we're getting value for money?
Well, I think the origin of the 6% was as a proxy for the target of not having an increase in real terms in the size of the estate costs. So it happened to be the percentage of the licence fee at the time. I think, as the NAO report points out, and I would agree with it, it wasn't a terribly sensible target to adopt, at least in retrospect. The executive came to us, I think, twice in 2010 and 2011 and asked to change the target. The Trust decided not to for a number of reasons, particularly because of the context which we were in at the time, which was, one, a licence fee settlement, and secondly, the DQF programme. So we, at that time, declined to change the target. What we did do, instead of simply measuring against the 6% target, we took a number of other performance measures, which, again, the NAO report details in terms of cost per person and cost per square metre and so on and so forth, and used those measures in addition to the 6% to look at the effective use of the estate over the period. Over the course of the last year, we've been talking to them about a revised property strategy and some revised measurements and targets. I think we're great believers in the fact that now that actually using several measures to judge success is the right way to go, rather than fixing on a single target, and actually the fate, as it were, of the 6% target is probably a good illustration of that. In answer to your question about how do we judge future efficiency, then I think we need to look in particular, again, as the NAO quite rightly point out, to benchmark costs. Benchmarks are very useful in looking at all aspects of property costs, whether those are actually the rent or the maintenance costs or the services costs and so on, and we intend to use those in addition to the sorts of measures that are already identified and we've already been using over the course of the last few years. So we can look at trends, we can look at benchmarks, and I think out of that we will be able to judge whether value for money and whether
so what's your ambition for? I mean, what you've really said to us, it was all a bit daft until recently. So we had this target which was a bit meaningless, and we didn't do much. And anyway, the executive weren't working to it, so it was a bit daft. We're now going to try and get a bit more sensible. Maybe I read this wrongly. How do we know what's sensible? I mean, we'll come to the benchmarks because the benchmarks don't look brilliant. But how, what pressure are you putting, particularly at a time of financial constraint? And and since 2010, you've had a flat licence fee as well, so you've had all those pressures. Maybe 6% is wrong. I've no idea.
Yeah, well, we're not proposing to use the 6% target at all in future. No.
And what's your ambition for the executive on the benchmarks?
Well, we're currently working through those benchmarks. It's useful to have the NAO report to be able to help us to establish, firstly, what the right measures are, and then secondly, what the right benchmarking group is to measure performance against, because for different elements of cost there are going to be different appropriate benchmarks. So we are putting together a series of measures, a small number of measures that we will use to do that in future.
And I think when will that happen? When is that?
Over the course of the next couple of months.
Your usage of Broadcasting House in terms of per square metre is quite impressive in terms of what you've driven down there. Therefore, there must be some concern, or how can you reassure us that your ability to drive down the benchmark of Broadcasting House against comparable space in the same area is about 49% higher according to the NAO report. So if you're going to move the overall benchmark, you're going to have to do something about your overall operating cost at Broadcasting House.
The rental on New Broadcasting House, is, as explained in the report, is around 80 million a year. We look at there are two parts to that. The first part is around 62 million, which is the interest payments and bond payments, and the remainder are the utilities and facilities. And we work extremely hard on the controllable element of the 26 million. And actually we benchmark pretty well, and we will continue to push that further. So we're at or under utility bill inputs. And obviously we use more electricity than perhaps an HQ building in W1, but our unit costs benchmark very well because we forward buy in an efficient way, for example. The second thing that we do is we work very, very hard on the utilisation of the building. So New Broadcasting House has an 8 metre square rate, which is about 1.3.
Which I accept is impressive, but it worries me that even on that 20 to million range, your ability to drive down from there is going to be impressive, because one of the reasons we've normally done it was to increase your use.
It's constrained over time. In terms of the 60 million bond, that you're completely correct. That is what it is, and that's a function of the capital costs that we invested in the building in the first place. I think what is important, though, that New Broadcasting House and the investment in it is part of the overall property portfolio, and it enabled a lot of savings elsewhere. So if we go back to the headline, the overall cost of the property estate is 4% less than it was when we started as a result of all this work.
But if I read the NAO report, the overall benchmark cost against comparable property is still some 30% higher than a comparable property. And I'm still not clear how I take your point about what you're doing in terms of utility bills, but how are you going to drive that down? That's got to come through usage per square foot, which means you're going to have more vacant space.
Yes, I think there's an element of that benchmarking that we're not going to be able to fix. What we have to concentrate on is on the overall cost and the utilisation of the building that we have. Because you're completely correct, to drive it much more below 8 metres squared when the benchmark is 11 would be very difficult. And there's a limit to what you can do through reprocurement and all the rest of it.
But the rest of your portfolio is on average 12.
Yes,
so
there's more capacity to bring the rest of the portfolio
And what would
down.
that drive in savings?
Well, the savings target to the end of the period is the 67 million, and that is based on getting us down to around about 10, 11.
And so, taking all of that into account, when you look back at the decision, I mean, I accept you weren't there in the early 2000s, but if you look back at the decisions, don't you think you're open to the criticism that actually you would have done better to expand West London, because the overall, even with the sunk costs that you want to put in technology, your overall operating costs would have been lower? You could have expanded that estate rather than putting it into Broadcasting House.
Well, the decision on Broadcasting House, you're correct, was taken a very long time ago, and it was complex, not least of which because it's a listed building. So, its secondary use would be different.
Yeah. Isn't the other one?
The point was you could have. There are usage for listed buildings which we know around. You could, whoever was taking the decision at the time, sitting here now, and I accept this as hindsight, but it does look as if it was the wrong decision to develop in central London, where the costs are inevitably higher, and they look already, as opposed to West London, where you could have driven operating costs considerably lower.
This is an expensive building. I think we can all accept that. I do remember, I don't want to sound awfully old, but 20 years ago when we moved the news operation and the current affairs operation in radio. out to White City. There being a great uproar of people saying we'll never travel out to White City. And of course, what we've done here, again, is to bring not only the news operation together, but also the news operation together with the World Service. And it is an iconic building, and the newsroom space must be the largest in Europe, if not in the world. So there are kind of benefits to that, but it is an expensive building.
There are also benefits for your customers, not just your listeners, but the people who are going to go on your programmes, because it's a lot easier to get to, frankly, than schlepping out to Hammersmith or Shepherd's Bush.
And I think
Can I just ask just following on from the Mrs. Hodges' questions about leases, how many of your, you've made quite right the point that why your strategy was there seems to me not unreasonable, but you've made how many of your leases do have break clauses in them? What percentage?
I'm sorry, I don't know that number. We'd have to come back to you on that. And the arrangements in each of them are slightly different.
Correct. I'd obviously accept that. Because obviously, presumably, in some of what I'm also trying to get some idea about is that because clearly in some of the leases, still even if you sublet, the primary lessee obligations will still be with you. You won't be able to pass those on.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm trying to get some balance about what costs you still may be able to pass on by subletting, and you're not.
Yes.
I'm not clear. That still is potentially a big area for.
Yes.
I would have thought you to work on driving your cost down.
It is. That's completely correct.
We can get back to you on that and give you a note on that. I would also say in the last 22 months that you and I have been working together, we've been signing short-term leases, as it happens, and no long-term.
Austin, then Gita.
I was wondering, looking back historically, if one of the problems of the BBC hasn't been the frequent changes of mind over what you're going to do with Broadcasting House, which is much more expensive than the properties around it, and you've changed your mind. It's been like the hokey-cokey, because you moved your whole self in, you moved your whole self out, moved your whole self back, and you shake it all about, and then you build it as a huge blossoming place. There's certain services have got to be, obviously, in London, but there's a lot more that can be dispersed. Why have there been so many changes of mind about Broadcasting House and what use it's going to be put to?
Well, I think if I look at the history right, in the early 2000s, the decision was taken to kind of reshape the whole of the BBC's property portfolio, and at that point, the decision was taken, which was not without controversy, to move Bush House into Broadcasting House, and therefore, at the right time, at the same time, to move the news operation from White City together. And I think these are non-financial things, Mr. Mitchell, but I think the combination now of the World Service being alongside our domestic services, and the fact that World Service correspondents and others can appear on the national services is an extraordinary strength, and a strength that we can now build on, as well as actually also delivering savings too. So I think that much has been, to my mind, utterly coherent for 2001, say, for the last 14 years. I think the other part of the property strategy, which is to say, how do we modernise this estate, reduce the number of buildings we've got, 2/3 of the buildings make them modern for today's broadcasting, but at a cost which is flat in money terms. That principle we've held to, and I think that's actually very impressive, given also the other restraint is that we're a national broadcaster and therefore have to have all sorts of buildings in all sorts of places because we're rightly reflecting the UK.
Well, yes, I can see that, because you want to interview me in somewhere nice and central and convenient. Yeah. But why is it so much more expensive? Broadcasting House.
The expenses, I think, as Bulford was explaining, the difficulty of Broadcasting House is both the cost of Broadcasting House and rebuilding an iconic building up to the sort of standards that can cope with the demands of a 21st century news operation and other operation, on top of the bond structure. And as we were saying earlier on, I think what we're doing is working very hard on the chunk of the running costs that we can control to make sure we get best value out of the money for the building. But I have to say, it's difficult to see how we can get more out of that building. The occupancy rates are very high. Half the output of the BBC comes from that building. And roughly a quarter of the staff of the BBC in that building, not just radio, not just news, but also television as well, and online.
are there not more functions that can be transferred out of London? I mean, I see from figure 12 that the costs in Manchester, Salford Quay, and we're told that it's underused, Salford Quay. I thought it was a magnificent building, but it's underused.
I think
the costs are so much lower, and the process of moving people or persuading people or bribing people to go from London to Manchester seems to have petered out.
No, it hasn't actually, and I think the third part of the strategy, Mr. Mitchell, was also to say let's move production and people out of London to the point where now half our production comes from outside London. And actually, if you look at Salford, where I was earlier this week, then in a way the BBC's moved there as a kind of anchor tenant on that site. ITV have come as well, and it kind of presaged, in a way, the whole Devo Mank debate and issues that are going on at the moment. So I think the BBC, I mean, nothing to do with me, it's not my time, but actually it was it was ahead of the game there. And we are looking now at ways that we can move more out of London rather. So actually, sorting out Birmingham is something very important to me. Because actually, I think Birmingham is a very important city. We've got good relationships there with the civic leaders and the local enterprise partnership, and we're going to build Birmingham around skills as well.
Okay.
Peter.
Can I first of all apologise that I'll have to leave in a minute because I have a school visit, which is taking the most important thing you can do as an MP. But I think, you just mentioned Devo Max, and undoubtedly the Scots do very well. I think this is not a party political point. I think the Scots do very well out of the UK government. But the unknown secret, perhaps, is how well Wales does out of the BBC. Yeah. And that's possibly reflected in Figure 6, which shows that we have something like 12% of the BBC estates in Wales, even though we have 5% of the population. So just the first question really is, you are now committed to building a new BBC Wales Centre in Cardiff. The first question then is, to what extent will that reduce the spare capacity within the estates in Wales? Because I understand that the spare capacity at the BBC Wales headquarters at the moment is about 40%. So what sort of reduction will we see, and what will be the overall reduction in the estates in Wales?
Can I just make an overall point? And I think, and Bulford maybe just go into a bit more detail. It struck me again on visits round the BBC that the Welsh Welsh Broadcasting House at Llandaff really is well past its sell-by date.
I think you first started looking at moving out in 1996.
15 years ago, something like that. What's kind of worse about it is also that it doesn't allow the sort of working that a modern news operation, primarily it's a news operation, kind of needs. That you want to have the service for Welsh language next to the English language services, television, online, all in and radio, all in one sort of. And as you know, because it's not like that at all. So it felt to me that this has been something that had been going round and round and round for some time, and we needed to make a decision. And I'm really pleased that the progress we've made with the Welsh Assembly Government, with Cardiff and the BBC, I think could lead us to a very good solution where actually it'll be a much smaller building, but a building which I hope will be an anchor tenant for others moving in. And I think there's some real interest in this in the site near the station, and that should reduce our rates of usage. It should increase rather our rate of usage as well, I think.
Yeah, it takes us the current site, because it's a Llandaff site, and also the site opposite is 25,000 square metres, and the new site estimate is 14,000 square metres.
So in terms of the figures here, it won't look quite out of sync.
It will reduce the vacant space by just over 1%.
Because one of the concerns I have is that I understand at the moment, obviously, the site in Llandaff is fully owned by the BBC.
Yes.
But the new site in the city centre will be a lease agreement.
Right. Yeah.
And my calculations from what I've read is that lease would be in excess of £3 million per year. So what will be the ongoing effect of this change on the finances of BBC Wales?
It will lead to a small increase in cost overall, because that additional lease cost, the cost of refurbishing all that technology, is offset by three things actually. First of all, the cost of running a bigger site. Secondly, the maintenance costs in BBC Wales at the moment are very significant to just keep things on air. Thirdly, there's some operational savings, and then there's also a small contribution because it's been announced that S4C are looking at sharing some facility. So it's a manageable increase in the annual cost.
So moving forward then, the situation is that there will be an increase in the cost of the estates in Wales, even though there will be a significant reduction in the space which is not utilised.
Yes, but it will also be in a fit-for-purpose building with technology which is appropriate for the digital age.
And
there's a huge technical debt in the current building in terms of what's there.
And the final question, back to referring to what Mr Hammond was asking, will there be a break clause on this agreement, or is it a long-term agreement?
We're still negotiating that, so I'm afraid I can't tell you.
Commercially confidential. Okay.
Right, let's get back to Television Centre, can we? Two issues. One is the Luxembourg link, in that at the bottom of figure 5, the deal you did with the Whitewood TV consortium used God knows how many. I think I've got a list somewhere of 9 or 10 Luxembourg companies. Clearly a tax avoidance scheme. What on earth were you doing signing up to that?
Well, the motivation on the Television Centre sale was clear, which is to get the best value for money we could back from that sale for the BBC, therefore for the licence fee payers. And I think it's on page 16, but you may correct me, where, yes, it is, on page 16, the second paragraph, where the report says the sale price was more than double what the BBC's advisors valued the site at in August 2008, in terms of profit of 78 million.
Can I just ask, how much did you pay your advisors?
I can't answer that question, but if you...
when you got more than twice yourselves what they'd told you were going to get for it, what did they say?
I wasn't around at the time. I'm simply reporting back, Mr. Bacon, to what the NAO report is saying there.
Write to us about that, because it's one of our niggling points.
You said you could get a better consideration if you structured the deal differently, actually, didn't it, at the time? I think that's what it said.
Anyway, the point, I accept you got more money than you know, although I'm slightly sceptical as whether you got a good deal. We'll come back to that, but it doesn't, that's not a good excuse, Paul, for selling it knowingly to a consortium that deliberately sets up a very, very complex structure. I'm trying to find my bit of paper. It tells me how many companies in Luxembourg, but sets up a really, really complex structure, purpose of which is only to avoid tax. Here we are, I've got it here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 companies. 10 companies, all in Luxembourg, all set up immediately after the deal.
So the sale of Television Centre generated a capital receipt of around 200 million.
You're avoiding the question.
No, I'm not. Not yet, I'm just starting. And in order to select that consortium, we undertook a full market process. And that came up with the sale to the consortium, which comprised Stanhope, a UK-listed company, AIMCO, which is the investment arm of the Alberta government, which deals with, amongst other things, their pension fund, and Mitsui, the well-established Japanese property developer, and that consortium was absolutely the lead bidder on value for money grounds. As is very common with overseas investors bringing capital into the UK, they brought their funds in via a EU investment vehicle based in Luxembourg, and they parcelled up the site into different blocks to give them flexibility as they developed the site. This was AIMCO's established practice for investment into Europe, and one which they've used on many occasions. We took full legal advice on this structure, which we shared with the Trust, and it was concluded that the structure was both lawful and commercially efficient. So we proceeded with the transaction as a way of realising full value for licence fee payers.
I'm quite shocked by that answer, if I may say so. It's sort of, you know, you're a public service broadcaster. You live and thrive on public money. And what you have said here, and we come this, I mean, you might have seen the occasional tax sessions that we've had here. What is absolutely clear is you knowingly sold on to, doesn't really matter whether they're a Canadian fund manager, or wherever they come from. The whole purpose is that this is a public asset that was being sold to them. I'm not sure you got best value. We'll come back to that. Public asset being sold to them, where they deliberately structured the way that they were going to manage that to avoid paying tax here in the UK on the profits they made out of that site. And they're putting hundreds of homes on there at some point. And I think both you and maybe Mr. Prettejohn wants to answer. I think you have a responsibility as public servants to protect the public interest. In the end, we don't get the taxes. You're going to get, it damages you, or it damages sort of British taxpayer in the long run. Not you directly, because your licence fee, but you still are a public service product. You're a public service. You always say you're a public service, and we support you on that basis. I just think it's shocking you did this. Shocking.
Do you mean not quite? What if I understand of this? You're saying that the way you did it produced more money for the BBC than it would otherwise have done. Is that right?
What I'm saying is that the consortium was the lead bidder in terms of value for money for the BBC as a result of a market exercise.
Yes, but what I'm saying is, had a bidder come along who didn't have this type of structure, I might take it that Whitewood TV City UK SAL was a special purpose vehicle for this international consortium,
yes,
with the Canadians, the Japanese and
yes,
the British. So that Whitewood was designed for the purpose of this transaction, yes, by that consortium. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Okay. What I was really asking was, had a consortium not come along and known that this is how that they were going to do it, are you saying it is likely that the value that the BBC would have received from the sale would have been lower than they were able to pay you because of the structure that they had?
I'm saying that we undertook a market exercise, and this was the best value bid which arose, rather than imagining that different structures might come through. This is what came through. It's lawful. It's investment in through an established route, and it's a very, very hard burden to put on the BBC or anybody else to have to make judgments about the way in which
presumably
I'd like Miss Bulford to be able to finish her sentence. It's a very hard burden to put on the BBC.
It's a very hard burden to put on the BBC to have to make subjective judgments. This is an established route for bringing international funds into the UK.
Yes, well, I
really important point here, which I think,
Stephen, can I just finish my point? Because I hadn't actually finished my line of questioning. I agree with what you're saying, but what I was trying to establish is, presumably, the reason they were able to bid more than others is because of this structure. That's why their bid was, from your point of view as the vendor, the most competitive one. And therefore, as it were, you got the benefit of this higher payment because they were in a position to make it, because they had this special purpose vehicle structure. Payments that would otherwise perhaps have later gone in taxes elsewhere, but which instead came early on in terms of the transaction here and benefited the BBC directly. Am I on the right track?
Well, the bid that the value that any developer will put on a bid will be a function of all sorts of different things, yes, including their ambition for the site, and the ambition of the consortium for the site is very substantial, and that's part of the reason. There are a number of factors coming to it. Our job is to evaluate the material that we have in front of us and to take advice on that to support it.
Sorry. I'm afraid I take a slightly different view to Mrs. Hodge on this one, because I think it is quite different, actually. It's a pretty normal route of bringing investment into the EU and therefore through. Presumably, they set up the 10 companies because they want to build the structure of the deal out at differing times, and therefore it would be not unusual in terms of parceling up chunks of investment in portfolios to portfolio, so you decrease your portfolio risk, particularly in terms of you're the pension fund. I think presumably your commercial advisor also said that the 10 companies were a pretty normal structure for development out of properties. I mean, you see that in the UK. It's not unusual for a UK developer to structure a SPV, of which there are 2 or 3 SPVs underneath it, and then they build the scheme out in differing phases. And presumably it may or may not be a tap, but presumably you could argue, and I would certainly argue in this particular case, that is much more likely the explanation.
Yeah.
And secondly, and the other thing is, who gave you legal advice?
Hogan Lovell, I believe, is right. Yeah. Sorry, let me check.
there is a difference in view among the committee. My own view is that you're a public body, and therefore, when you're disposing of what in effect are public assets, there is a responsibility on you to ensure that the people to whom you dispose the asset manage it in a way which doesn't avoid tax.
See, I find that there is a complete disagreement. I think. Sorry to have this argument in public, but I think it's probably not an unhealthy thing. What Anne Bulford said, I think, was rather important. It's a very high burden to place on the BBC that they should do this. What I think you're saying, Chair, is that the BBC should sell it to the person whom the BBC will be sure pays the most tax in the future. And I think that is the burden of what you're saying. And it seems to me that's an unreasonable burden to place on an organisation like the BBC. I would expect the BBC to sell it to the entity that is going to be the best for the BBC. Your responsibilities are not to worry about the defence of the nation or whether we've got enough tanks or whether other entities out there in the future pay X or amount of tax rather than Y amount of tax. Your responsibilities are to the BBC. And I think if you fail in those responsibilities, then you should be called to account for that. But if you're acting in a way that protects the position of the BBC and indeed produces more money from the BBC, for the BBC than your own advisers told you that you would produce, then you fulfil your responsibilities rather well. And I think it's unfair to criticise you for having acted in a way and gone ahead with the transaction where the subsequent owner of the property acted in a way that might subsequently produce less tax in the future. Because, of course, what will happen in the future, as I think Lenin said, prediction is always difficult, especially about the future. You can't know to what uses the property will be put in the future. They could be multifarious, and in any case, even if they were multifarious, they could change from what the original buyer had decided. So it's placing not a very high burden on you. I think it's in placing an impossible burden on you. It's not at all obvious to me that it's one that you should be expected to bear. So I think there is a clear disagreement between the Chair and other members of the committee on this.
On what?
Pardon? Well, I do disagree. Apologies. I mean, I really do strongly disagree. I think there is an onus on public bodies to make sure that when they deal with public assets, that they don't do so to the detriment of the public purse. And this is the way in which you've handled this is to the detriment of the public purse. And I feel really, very, very strongly about it. Did you discuss it? Let me ask this question.
No evidence of that. There is evidence there is evidence of the fact that it's been to the benefit of the BBC, which is what these folk are responsible for.
You don't know. Did you discuss at all the fact that the structure was being set up was to avoid tax? Did you discuss that?
I can't tell you that because we weren't around at the time.
Did you discuss it in the Trust?
I wasn't around at the time, but I've seen the minutes and I've seen the legal advice. And it was quite clear from the Trust's point of view that our primary duty was to make sure that the licence fee payer got the best possible deal. Secondly, that the structure was legal. Thirdly, that the structure was commercially appropriate. And fourthly, that there was nothing unusual about this structure. And the legal advice that we got on all of those points was very clear.
In other words, when you say unusual, you mean that it was not novel or contentious?
Yeah.
Just acting within the tax framework that was set up.
We're going to have to shut up about this in public, but it is the whole issue that it is too commonplace for structures to be set up which avoid tax.
But government should change that then. If government doesn't like it, change it.
They should stop voting for tax relief then.
Well, we agree with that. That's probably the one thing we do agree about. Let me ask you another question about television centre sale. The television centre. There's been a lot around about whether or not the building is fit for purpose. Endless quotes that I was able to get hold of. I've just had to try 7 toilets across 3 floors of Broadcasting House before finding one that was actually available for me to use, head of technology at BBC Radio. I suggest we extend the meeting room booking system to the toilets. And another one about loos. I don't often manage to find an available toilet on my own floor and spend increasingly urgent minutes trying to find one on the other floors. one from a World Tonight produced reporter. On one single day before Christmas, I had to deal with our telephone system not working, the internet connection breaking down, and the Davina system for searching out archive having an ongoing issue. Fed up with trying to work like this, I set off for the canteen, but the lift was broken, and the automatic door still had its sign apologising for the inconvenience of its continued breakdown. How in a brand new building with brand new equipment can so many of the fixtures and fittings not work properly?
Well, we've got a building, as we were saying earlier, which is being intensively used by over 6,000 people, plus guests coming in and visitors and so on. And running a building, I know, both in this life and in my previous life, you've got to be on top of things that aren't working, toilets that aren't working, lifts that aren't working, all those sort of facilities that aren't working. And it's something personally I feel that we've got to keep on top of and do better at. And I think, although, I have complaints from people too, telling me that this doesn't work or that doesn't work, I do feel the facilities management people, the people who are running the building, are doing a good job and are being more responsive to the complaints of our staff. It's really important that we have a good workplace, so in that much I think we're united.
So, I mean, are there two more? Is it just they've hit the press? Are the loos always not out of order?
Well, I wander around quite a bit, I mean, I don't see loos that are consistently out of order, and what I know about the BBC staff is if things aren't working, they'll tell me, and I'll respond to that, and that's the benefit of going around the buildings and seeing what's happening.
And can I ask you, on page 18, figure 7, just an interesting little figure there. Your car parks, your square meterage of car parks is about half of your square meterage of studios.
Yeah, I mean, the car parking is distributed pretty widely around the UK, and it encompasses car parks which are used for outside broadcast and other production equipment vehicles, as well as staff car parking. There is quite a lot of car parking underneath the W12 estate, which again will come out of these numbers when we release that. But we don't have any car parking at all at New Broadcasting House. It's very limited on other sites, and we have mechanics for staff paying for use, which is anything.
So what's that coming down to?
I don't know. I'd have to check that, the percentage coming out of that.
Anything else, anybody? Austin?
Well, it's just a patriotic question, actually. Not your kind, Margaret. Why is there so little use of premises and facilities in Yorkshire, and why has the concentration in the north all gone to Manchester? I mean, if you look at the square metre usage on figure 6, enormous in the northwest, 33,000. But Yorkshire together, that's East Yorkshire and Yorkshire itself, only amounts to about 7,000 square metres. Now, why is it so concentrated in Manchester and not spread out over the north?
I think the benefits of Salford, and you yourself have...
Well, it's magnificent in Salford, but Leeds is wonderful too.
I know Leeds is wonderful. I've been in Hull too, and I think that's also wonderful. My point about Salford, Mr. Mitchell, was just to say that concentrating Radio 5 Live, sport, children's in Salford, in Manchester, has by the scale of that, has led to other people coming along, and we have become a kind of anchor tenant, and there's been growth on the back of that. Now, that doesn't mean that in a smaller scale we can't do other things around the country as well. I'm very interested in how we grow the journalism in Yorkshire. I've spent 2 visits so far to Hull to see how we can help Hull culture capital of the UK, City of Culture rather, for 2017, and I think there are things we can do there. So please don't take a lack of a very big building as being disinterestedness or uninterested in what's happening in Yorkshire. I think we've got a big role there. I'm very proud of what the teams are doing in Yorkshire, and I hope we can help to do an even better job.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
Report.
No.